Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis, LA and dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello?
Hello, could I please speak with Imani Perry?
This is she.
Imani, this is Paul Holdengräber calling you from the Quarantine Tapes. I'm so happy to speak to you and so happy that you're part of this project. How are you today?
Oh, thank you. I'm thrilled to speak with you.
It's a real pleasure. How are you today?
That's a great question.
It's a question which is so different now than maybe 3 months ago.
Absolutely. I mean, I feel simultaneous kind of enormous gratitude to be well and to have everyone in my family be well and, safe, relatively speaking, and then also the kind of fear and I think collective grief that we're experiencing, both for people but also for all of these taken for granted aspects of daily life. And so, it's just there's this constant, complicated mix of emotions.
Not one thing and not another, but a real mixture.
Right. Yeah. How are you?
Collective grief.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by that?
I think it's hard to apprehend in the sense that, it's our relationship to numbers is so odd in that, we have some sense of, massive loss, but it's as though the kind of the individual story is much more likely to animate us or to elicit an emotional response in the vast quantities of people who we've lost, each of whom, has a meaningful story. So I think it's even hard to articulate because the standard rituals we have, right, for mass grief, conduct of war, or all those are not exactly appropriate. So
language fails us.
Mm-hmm.
And that's perhaps why someone like you continues to write.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
I said language fails us, and that is perhaps why you continue to write.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Where do I find you at this moment?
I am sitting in my bedroom. I have a chair by the window, and so I get direct light, and this is where I have been.
In working. Philadelphia?
Yes.
And Imani, you have been teaching, right, during this semester?
Yes.
And how has that been? How has Zoom been for you?
I think it was difficult because there's all these kind of nonverbal and subtle ways that I think a classroom, and it's classroom, but you nurture the classroom, but we nurture each other. And this was a moment where there's all these kind of aspects of the historian that are deprived, right? Because we're all through a computer screen, and also for the students, a significant amount of sadness and immediate loss, right? So there's both the seniors who are thinking, oh, I won't graduate, but then also the kind of immediate loss of community, some of them are family members of friends. And so emotionally, teaching online was a difficult experience because so many of the good aspects of teaching were deprived. But I also was sort of found myself in taking the readings with almost a sort of fresh eyes, and the stakes of a lot of the questions that we try to raise in class about justice, about liberation, all these ideas, they were heightened in the moment.
Really, heightened because of the moment. And this brings me, Imani, to something that I loved you said about reading some years ago, not long ago, and in your estimation, too late, had you known what you were about to read, which is Saramago's Blindness. You said he transformed my conceptions of both the political and psychological novel. And I'd love you to say more. How so? And in this particular moment, how does that book, which you read late in life, strike you?
Yes. Oh, it's I mean, it's harrowing, right?
Yeah, I knew this question is not a simple one, and I love all the pauses we have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're thick with meaning. I mean, so the novel. I mean, in part, it's about a plague, and so there's something very immediately kind of resonant. But then also, what the question about sort of what becomes of us in an experience of not just extreme vulnerability, but having the known world shift dramatically, right? And I think of that, the sort of the disability of blindness as a plague in that novel. In a sense, it feels metaphoric for what we're experiencing. This is unprecedented in so many ways, and we don't know what the end is, and we don't even really. There's modeling, but
we don't know what the middle is.
Right, and all of that happening, I think, is the kind of underlying anxiety that I felt all the way through the novel, the exploration of sort of what it does, what the experience of that plague does to character, and the prospect of intimacy, and the sort of not knowing what will unfold at that emotional basis. I think is resonant, and probably we should be thinking of it as instructive.
Which other books are helping you through this period, think through this period, and because I mean in saying what you said about Saramago, I got the impression, I think it is a correct perception, I hope, that books can have an enlightening effect on understanding our present.
Yes.
And which ones would you? What does Imani tell us now that we must read that might help us a little bit?
That's interesting. I mean, I find myself thinking a lot about Raymond Williams' writing on the structure of feeling, and I think I'm returning to that because the Williams describes sort of the sense in which we can only understand the world that was after the moment of transformation. And so I do wonder, I guess part of what I'm thinking is that, this is a moment of some degree of permanent transformation. We do have to see the world that we've departed from with greater clarity, and it's evidencing itself in all of the unequal distribution of suffering, or the ways in which we're not imagining how to care for not just the entire nation, but the entire world in this moment, but instead deepening inequality. So Williams has been on my mind. Of course, Octavia Butler because she sort of had a prophetic imagining of where the world is going that feels very prescient.
And which book in particular were you saying?
Parable of the Sower and then Parable of the Talents.
Right.
Although there's, there are other works that deal with a kind of, the cyborg reality that is also interesting because we're part machine now, at least in our sociality, right? And then,
have you been thinking about your own work on Lorraine Hansberry at this moment, and how perhaps she would have reacted to this unqualifiable moment?
I have some, I think I thought about her in large part because, she was a person who was not focused on a single axis of both the idea of liberation or what it meant to do meaningful work in the world. And she thought about all kinds of forms of inequality, but also different sort of political and philosophical imaginaries. And so I think of her as always as a model for how to think through a moment and how important it is to register the world outside of your kind of immediate concern or interest. And so I have thought about her, and then also with all of the premature death, I've thought about her. She died at 34 with a great deal of work that she had accomplished, but also a great deal unfinished. And there's been so many artists and intellectuals almost every day. It feels that you hear a story about one departing, and so even so for me that kind of resonates with this feeling of grief.
I was about to say we're back to that.
Yeah.
But what I really took to in what you said now is that she works for you, she functions for you as a model of how to think. And in thinking about talking to you, I was particularly struck that as an undergraduate you studied mathematics, and you say, as a scholar, everything I do when I analyze anything is mathematically oriented. Every time I write about literature or about social phenomena, I'm always looking for patterns, repetition, structure, the size relationship between things. I'd love you to say more about that. And then also, do you think of your books as equations you are solving or as shapes you're constructing? And if so, what is a shape?
Oh, that's an interesting. Oh, well, okay, I'll start with.
Sorry. You were wondering, where shall I start, and do we have an hour and a half? The answer is we don't have an hour and a half, and you just need to start somewhere. I'll say this. For me, part of what is actually made me most anxious about this moment is the numbers. You mentioned that in the beginning.
It's not just the numbers of people we've lost, but who are ill, but what's being tracked. For me, sort of given the reality that there's different rates of testing and different degrees of access to medical care and different sort of willingness to make oneself vulnerable. For example, for the dangers of someone who's undocumented who may have COVID feeling anxious about going to the hospital or something like that. And so you get these sort of numbers that come across our screens, whether they're TV screens or computer screens again and again. And it's very hard to puzzle through the relationship between them. And so for me, it creates an anxiety about sort of not even really sort of being able to make a careful diagnosis of, and for someone who thinks of, I think for all of us who think of the work that we do as somehow being meaningful for the world, there's a comfort in feeling like you can make certain kinds of diagnostics right? And this is very much out of my grasp, and that actually is for me maybe the most uncomfortable part, right? I know things are bad, but it's hard to know how or what will unfold, and it is the absence of sort of knowing that everything is being tracked in a similar way.
And in terms of your thinking about literature and thinking about it with the background of an interest that you abandoned in terms of studying because you studied literature, but it remained with you. And I often think of some of the writers I like best, whether it's Primo Levi, being a physicist, or whether it's Max Frisch, being an architect, or whether it is Imani having equations and the beauty of formulas, as you have said, of mathematics on your mind, and also always perhaps as a shadow. And so maybe you can talk to me a little bit about that shadow.
Sure. I mean, I do think that, part of the way that, and this is sort of, it's interesting because it requires me to kind of reflect on what I'm drawn to in works of literature, not just as a critic, but as a story. We talk pretty frequently about the sort of narrative structure. I guess I'm interested in the way, and this appears in lots of different writers for me, from Baldwin to Morrison to Borges to Marquez, where the structure itself exists in a way that it allows us to see what's happening in the gaps. Often at the way we recount history, or we make sense of the world, and so even while sort of attentive to structures and trying to diagnose relations between this and that part that is hard to describe in a tidy fashion is also a part of the work. And so I think in some sense it's both sort of the mathematical and that which feels like it's not. I mean, although of course to a certain extent everything is what is interesting to me, the structured and the organic, although the organic is always structured. But that's and I do think that's that's also part of what we're dealing with now is the sort of as structures fall apart.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. The connections are, one can make many of them. And I know that these questions I'm asking you are rather questions for reflection and not for an instantaneous answer. So I'm very appreciative of the fact that you're thinking along the questions and thinking how to approach them, as it were. There's a moment that a famous moment you recount of Hansberry meeting Robert Kennedy and James Baldwin. Can you recount briefly that moment, and also who in a meeting with, be it Obama or Bill Clinton or perhaps even the current president, would be willing to speak in that way?
Oh, well, the latter question is a huge one that I think is essential for us to try to think about. But I'll start by describing the meeting. So the Robert F. Kennedy invited James Baldwin and asked him to, bring a group of his friends as to respond to this kind of civil rights crisis from the perspective of the White House. Actually, in my hometown of Birmingham, and the idea was that these sort of public figures would calm down the civil rights protesters. And so in that room was included Jerome Smith, who was an activist who was up in New York from poor. He'd been in the Mississippi Delta. There was Rip Torn. There was Martin Luther King Jr.'s assistant, Lena Horne. And they had a sort of uncomfortable and relatively tense exchange. And then Jerome Smith, who was the sort of on-the-ground organizer, erupted with some frustration and said, and talked about the kind of inconsistency in expecting the Black Americans to fight for the United States abroad, given what was happening in the segregated South. And RFK was somewhat dismissive of Jerome Smith, and this incensed Lorraine Hansberry. And she sort of subverted the whole discussion and said, not only are we not willing to sort of try to quell protests, but we actually see those people who are protesting as speaking for us, and we want a moral commitment from the United States. And almost immediately, really by the next morning, all of the news media talked about RFK feeling like the meeting was a failure because Hansberry walked out along and the other participants followed her. But what did happen was a shift in the national discourse, and soon thereafter, you began to see JFK speaking about civil rights in a moral framework, which really was not happening at all previously, even though it clearly was a righteous struggle. To ask that question now is about sort of what kind of person or who could occupy that space.
Yes.
It's so challenging because I think, one, there is less of a kind of built-in network of artists and intellectuals who have overtly embraced the idea that their commitments to truth and justice are more important than personal gain. So those were people who were, and I don't mean there's plenty of individuals who do, but there's something about having a community that bolsters those beliefs and expectations. And in the absence of it, I think what happens is, artists or writers or thinkers who stick their neck out on political issues are often left twisting in the wind alone, which would not have happened. I mean that to say that the moment is so different. I think there's less sort of collective resources for artists speaking out against injustice wherever it's found. So that's hard to imagine. And then I guess another piece that makes it hard to imagine is that there's a ways in which people sort of speak, challenging the radical ideas, but their voices so easily get sort of commodified and wrapped up in just sort of marketing or self-branding that it also becomes hard for those moments to have the effect that they once did. So it's a long way of saying I don't know.
No. And so the person is still to come. Recently you wrote a brief comment about Little Richard, and you said we have a lot to learn from the way Little Richard claimed his place and his impact. Humility is not always a virtue. Sometimes it is a form of submission. So, Imani, Little Richard, for you and that comment about him, I'm curious.
Yes. I mean, he was fantastic. And he in some ways very much like Lorraine Hansberry, because she would similarly, she would say, as someone criticized her work, and she said, well, that she would frequently respond with, there are problems with my work, but what you have said is a problem is not the problem. And let me explain what's wrong with your analysis. And, she wrote her own criticism. And in a sense, that's what Little Richard did as well. He claimed a place when he had been roundly marginalized in the history of rock and roll. And every time he was on a platform, he would remind people his role as a progenitor. And I think that was important because it was, without that, it's hard to imagine that he would have had the kind of public memorial that he did. I mean, he really did have to stake a claim. And, I think we think of humility as the virtue because, of course, we don't like egomania and self-centeredness and all of those things. But it is also important if you have been, part of a story that is meaningful beyond your own self-interest to speak up.
So interesting. So interesting. Yeah. I after he died, I watched some videos of him. I mean, it's just extraordinary at every level. Yeah. The gestures, the incarnation of the music, yeah, and the movement. Imani, in closing, I know something about you that maybe some people don't quite know, and I would love you to talk a little bit about it. I think you are in the process now of thinking about writing a book about the color blue. Now, not just about the color, a history of the color blue in some way. And I often think of the extraordinary comment in the Letters on Cézanne of Rainer Maria Rilke, where he says that he would wouldn't it be extraordinary if somebody wrote a biography of the color blue? So, yeah, what are you thinking about when you're thinking about blue?
Oh, so many things. And this has actually been a wonderful time because, the moments when we walk outside or we're sitting inside by our windows, and I'm often looking up into the sky and noting the color, but also, it's one of these commonalities across everywhere, right? Sort of the perception, the reality, but also the perception of blue, the sky, the water, the way that it is both, ubiquitous in the natural world, but also it's the world's favorite color. There is a pleasure that's taken in blue, and the history of the preciousness of blue pigment as evidence of that. It's a color that's both cool and hot. And it also, it's an important color for me in terms of cultural tradition, whether it's paint blue that, in the coastal South that was supposed to ward away angry spirits, or cobalt blue bottles on trees that would hold suffering spirits captive and protection for you, or the music, the blues, and what does it mean to name a musical form that really captures sort of the range of human emotion, blue. I think that's not, it's not incidental. There's this resonance, and then there's the towns that are blue, and Chefchaouen and Jodhpur and Mombasa, and so it's this color that has this global appeal and then also very specific references, and I find that fascinating.
I can't wait. And exactly what I thought would happen happened. It was just a too brief pleasure to speak to you, Imani.
It's always wonderful to speak with you.
I thank you so much. And for the moment, I send you a virtual hug. And I hope soon it will be possible to give you a real hug. But for now, stay safe, stay well. Reflect more on blue. I can't wait to read your ruminations. It's going to be extraordinary.
Thank you so much, Paul. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye, Imani.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.